With 50 days until the presidential election and voting in some states already underway, the campaigns are doing everything they can to organize and get out the vote. In our series, America's Right to Vote, Caitlin Huey-Burns takes a look at the impact a large group of voters described as the rising American electorate could have on the outcome.
A lot of us have this kind of like woke mentality where we're paying a lot more attention to the issues around us.
Voters like Dante Phillips are among the most coveted this election cycle.
If you really want young people to vote, you're going to have to talk about things that they're interested in.
A recent college graduate, Phillips is part of what's called the rising American electorate, made up of young voters, people of color, and unmarried women. Combined, these three groups account for over half of the people who voted in 2016. And in 2020, turnout among this group could be even higher if campaigns effectively engage them.
With the incredible energy and commitment to our democracy coming out of the George Floyd protests, we're seeing increased interest in voting and increased interest in learning how to participate in our democracy.
Tom Lopak is the CEO of the nonpartisan Voter Participation Center, an organization helping to register and mobilize this group of voters during a pandemic.
We are living in a moment more than ever where Americans are seeing the direct connection between their lives, their challenges, their opportunities, and how government serves them.
But that doesn't mean they are willing to just hand over their vote.
I honestly think that 50 and under in the African-American realm are starting to realize that we don't have to be devoted to a party, that we need parties to be devoted to us.
Corey Prince is a community organizer in the key Battleground of Wisconsin and has a message for both political parties.
The voters feel disengaged. They feel unheard. They feel that the issues that are important to them are not on the mouths of the politicians who are trying to be elected or want to be representing the people.
You're not seeing that ground level, person-to-person engagement that you're describing. You're not seeing that.
Not at all. Not at all.
While turnout among young voters and Asian Americans increased slightly in 2016, turnout among African Americans dropped. And overall, nearly 7% of eligible voters in the rising American electorate didn't vote 4 years ago.
Do you think that there will be people who say, why should I vote? What difference is it going to make?
There's like an idea that people are apathetic about this election. And I reject that apathy. And the only reason that I do is because I don't think it's apathy. I think the problem is access.
Victoria Sandoval is a 24-year-old living in Texas, a state with one of the largest shares of the rising American electorate. One barrier to voting is registration. This group is transient, moving between election cycles and less likely to own a home. They're also more likely to live below the poverty line.
I understand not wanting to engage with the system, but I also think that if every single person who is an eligible voter who feels that way did engage with the system and did vote, our country would look so different.
The pandemic and racial injustice are the major issues that cut across these groups and have become a rallying cry to get engaged in the process.
It is time for us to change our ways of performative action and to make actual change.
Enthusiasm is one thing, converting it into voting is another.
I'm not worried about people not turning out. I'm worried about how accessible this election is going to end up being for people who need to vote, whose voices need to be heard.
I feel like people are aware of the size of the demographic, but I'm not sure if they're aware of the impact, depending on how this election plays out. I'm sure people will become more aware of just like how influential our demographic is.
The Center for Voter Participation and its partners have registered 1 million people to vote this year. And this month, they're planning to send 37 million applications to vote by mail. Now, I know we're marking 50 days into Election Day, but in some cases, it's actually closer than that. Vlad and Anne-Marie, this Friday, 4 states are going to start early voting.
That is exactly an important reminder, Caitlin. And in your piece, you note that the rising American electorate is more than half of the electorate, but that nearly 7% of eligible voters in this group didn't turn out 4 years ago. Why not? And how critical are they in 2020?
This is an extremely critical group, especially because a lot of them could be up for grabs if they are properly engaged. According to voters that we spoke with and experts who have been studying this, it's a mix of a couple of different things. It's a mix of apathy, especially among younger voters who are kind of questioning, why should I turn out to vote? What difference will this actually make? And it's also a mix of access. We noted that quote from Victoria Sandoval, who was saying that people that she talks to and her friends and family, it's not necessarily that they don't want to show up to vote, it's that they don't know the access that they have to voting. Registration is really key here because these groups, as we mentioned, are kind of mobile. So it's a mix of apathy, it's a mix of access, and that gap between registration and actually showing up means that proper engagement from campaigns may be able to make the difference in some cases.
So how could expanded vote by mail options help with turnout among these groups?
Well, this is going to be critical because since we're in a pandemic, I mean, most people register to vote in person through things like a DMV. With those closed or not accessible to a lot of people, these outside groups are trying to figure out how to target people online. Vote by mail, we've seen in research from the Voter Participation Center, could be especially effective for Latino voters and Asian American voters who tend to vote in higher numbers by mail than other members of the rising American electorate.
So what were some of the most important issues for the voters you spoke with? It's interesting, Caitlin, as you know, all the polling suggests that people, for the most part, have made up their minds. There are people who are voting for Vice President Biden, and there are people who are sticking it out with President Trump. But it would strike me that voters like these, as you say, are the ones that are up for grabs. But I guess my question is, do the issues like strong support of the military, lower taxes, better access to health care, do people care about those questions? Or is it just now driven by, I'm in it for this particular candidate or I'm against this particular candidate?
It's really interesting because the issues that we heard over and over were healthcare, especially in a pandemic. And remember, because this is a transient group, that means that, healthcare may not necessarily be tied to their job, or if you're moving or moving jobs, access to healthcare is especially important. And a lot of people in the rising American electorate, this is an issue that's important to them. Some of them are close with their families or live with their families. And of course, the issues of racial injustice and police reform are other issues that we heard, especially from younger voters. But it was really interesting talking to Corey Prince, the activist and mobilizer in Wisconsin, who was saying that what he's hearing from the candidates, especially from the Biden campaign, is very surface level. He's really concerned that the Democratic campaigns are not actually targeting voters with issues that directly affect them. He was saying that a lot of it is just anti-Trump messaging. Vote for me because I'm not Trump. Well, he was saying that doesn't really cut it because he says people that he's been talking to, they've been living with Trump. They know it's an issue. They want to see representation, and they want to see how these issues are directly affecting them. He brought up the issue of police reform. He said that even has been very surface level, that candidates have been talking about banning chokeholds. I mean, he told us that, okay, that's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of addressing these issues. So a lot of it is not only speaking to issues that these voters care about, but having more of an affirmative case for the campaign, not just vote for me because I'm not the other guy.
In 2018, during the midterms, we saw that women were a real driving force behind Democratic gains, especially unmarried women. What do we expect from this group in 2020, in this next upcoming election?
Well, this really could make the difference for the campaigns. You mentioned women were a driving force in 2018. We saw, especially in the suburbs, women breaking away from the Republican Party and voting for Democrats as a way to send a message to Donald Trump. They said they responded negatively to his rhetoric and behavior. In 2020, The Voter Participation Center is expecting that over a quarter of voters will be unmarried women. So this is a really critical group. And you're seeing this in polling too, going to make the difference between a Biden or a Trump. If these voters show up in the numbers and continue to say the things that they were saying in 2018 about what they were responding to, this really is a force rising in the electorate.
Yeah, and we've seen, I mean, one of the things that was interesting, the New York Times had an interesting report this weekend, Caitlin, I'm sure you saw it, that the message that President Trump has been hammering Joe Biden on, with the law and order message, has not been resonating in places like in Minnesota. I want to ask you about this new CBS News Battleground tracker poll, which shows Joe Biden leading in states like Minnesota, like Arizona. Digging behind those numbers, what are we seeing is the reason why those numbers are favoring Vice President Biden? Because one of the things that I think is really fascinating is, Caitlin, there have only been 3 big blowout elections in recent memory. You had 1964, you had 1972, and then you had 1984. Generally, blowouts don't happen anymore in modern U.S. presidential elections. And there are a lot of people who, if you're a Democrat, you're sort of wondering, who are these millions of people that are supporting President Trump, given the things that drove some of those elections to be blowouts that we're not seeing right now? So when you dig into the states like Arizona and Minnesota, what are you seeing driving those numbers in Biden's favor?
Well, this appears to be an election that's shaping up as a referendum on Trump's handling of the coronavirus. I mean, this is a pandemic that has exposed a lot of different things. It has exposed pandemics within the pandemic that we've talked about in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of the economy, the joblessness that has resulted as a consequence of the pandemic, and also it has really, of course, uprooted everybody's lives. We're September now. The big issue is kids returning back to school. This is an issue that when you're thinking about everyday Americans, people that are not necessarily paying attention to the ins and outs of what the parties are doing, how they're messaging, they're kind of looking at what their bottom lines are, and that's their personal economy and also these decisions that they have to make about their own families and their children. So this is, the pandemic is kind of more than just a health crisis, which is obviously it is, but it is affecting people in a variety of different ways. There's many, many layers to it. And so we're seeing in these battleground state polls that Trump's approval on or disapproval, I should say, on coronavirus is really helping to fuel Biden, even more so than how the president's doing on the economy, because we've seen that Trump still leads on the economy in a lot of places. Voters are willing to give him kind of the benefit of the doubt on that message, but handling of coronavirus is something that we're seeing fuel Biden.
All right, Caitlin, great article, great deep dive. It's really good. Thank you so much. So you can read more of Caitlin's reporting on this issue and check out the rest of the series. It's called America's Right to Vote. You can find that at cbsnews.com.